Hi, I'm Shanna Rendon. Welcome to Template Tasting. Today we'll look at a couple of methods to make some basic feathers. Basic feathers with straight spines or no spines, because feathers are a favorite pattern of many quilters and they can transform a simple quilt into something more extraordinary. They add a bit of elegance and texture to any project. They're also incredibly versatile because you can fill almost any shape or area within your quilt. But today we'll just look at how to stitch out some basic straight spine feathers, and we'll work on our backtracking. These are templates from two Westerly Design feather sets. The feathered leaf template set is on the left and the feather set is on the right. And today we'll use only the feather set and the straight spine. The variations we'll talk about are spine or no spine. What part of the feather do we choose to backtrack, because stitching feathers usually requires that we backtrack on some portion of the plumes. And do you prefer to stitch one row of the plumes along the spine or alternate sides by switching from right to left and repeating that to complete the feather? This is a close-up of the 5-inch feather template, which is part of the Feathers template set of 4 templates. They come in sizes 2 inch, 3 inches, 4 inches, and 5 inches. It kind of looks like bunny ears. One bunny ear makes one plume of the feather, and there are 2 etched lines marking the center. The center of the feather we will use to line up on the spine. And there are etched lines on either side of the center at 1/4 inch intervals. And you can see I like to put stable tape on the center of my template as well as the outside corners, especially on the larger templates in the set. These are the feather spines. There are 2 sizes available. One is 10 inch and one is 12 inches. One side is straight and the other side is curved. We'll be using the straight side in this class and then move on to the curved side in Feathers Part 2. And upcoming feather template tasting sessions will explore other Westerly Design feathers for an upcoming Sew Steady University class or 2. Okay, so let's begin stitching feathers. This is the instruction sheet that comes with your templates. So I'm going to show you how to stitch all the different methods that are listed here. So we'll start with this method. Okay. My fabric, I have a lot of stripes on here. So what I did was I marked with the red strips. This is 3.5 inches apart. And this is the center of the 3.5 inches, which will be my spine. So I've got a 3.5 inch column here, here, and here. So I don't want my feathers to extend beyond the red line. And the purple line will be where the spine should be. However, the first example I'm going to show you is no spine at all. We're going to stitch from one side to the next side and back and forth. A nice, easy way to stitch out your feathers. The diagram is marked with an A and a B. So I put that A and B right here on my templates so that you can, as you follow along, you can watch the diagram. That said, the first plume of the feather is almost always stitched a bit differently from the remainder of feather plumes. So I'm either going to backtrack from B to A if I want a partial plume at the base of the feather, or stitch the entire plume. Then whatever you do, repeat the same thing for the first plume on the other side of the spine. So this is a 3-inch feather template with A and B marked. So I know that my project, I want to stitch from here, from the spine out. So I'm just going to go ahead and put my needle down in the spot that I wish to start. Let's see. Another thing I forgot to show you is I put this solid line under A, and the solid line under A, that tells me the point at which I can stitch around my feather, and when I stitch around, I will have my needle placement at the same spot. So that is one complete feather. To line my template up now, I want to put the center on the spine, and I have 1/4 inch increment lines going all the way across the feather. And since this is the 3-inch template, my completed feather will fit easily between the red fabric reference lines. So this is the center line lined up on my purple spine line. Yeah, I'll start at the spine and I'll go ahead and stitch the whole feather. Now I don't need to do any backtracking because I completed one little feather, or one little plume of my feather, and now I just need to switch the template and line up the center here and go ahead and stitch the other side. Now I just need to backtrack to position C. Okay, so here's the thing. I forgot to put C on my template, and C is about the 4th line in from the outside. So I put a C here and here, and I've added a B on the 3rd line. Right here. So now these letters now match up with the instruction sheet. C, moving my template up, and stitch back to the spine A. Then I slide over, and so stitch from position C back down to A, and move the template to the other side. Line up the center and stitch around to B. And now backtrack to C. Do you see my mistake here? My template was not lined up on A, and my feather plume is far too small, but I'm going to continue. Line up the center. And line up this line A with the needle. Back to C, slide the template up, and stitch back to A. Switch sides, line up A. And I also want to make sure that when I'm stitching back, that I know that my stitching around here is going to meet my previous stitching. So you can always check that with your spacing gauge. the template, line up the center line. Stop at C. Line up the center. And stop at the spine. And stop here. And then make sure this is lined up with your needle. That will enable you to get the correct height on your feathers. I'm going to try to show you this from different angles so you can see the placement of the template, where you start, where you stop. Line up A with the needle, the center on my spine, center line on my spine, and I don't want to exceed the limit I've set for myself here. So what do we want to do at the top? Usually it's add a finial. So I'm going to go back to the spine, we're about there. So my spine here, and I'm going to put just a little piece of a feather at the top. So I don't want to exceed my limit here, so I've got to keep this within a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to come back to the feather on the other side about here. So how about I'll just come up here, just make a few stitches back on my feather, and that is a finial of sorts. If I wanted a larger finial, all I had to do was just stop with a little bit more room at the top so that I could stitch that in. None other than a loop right here. But if I've got a loop here, one of the first things I do is double check the height of my ruler foot, and it might be just a little too high, so I set it down just a little bit more. Sometimes when you get loops and you're stitching like this, all you have to do is lower the ruler foot, and that makes a nice difference. This is feathers with no spine. If I wanted a spine, all I'd have to do is, when I was here stitching my finial, is grab either my 12-inch arc or my spine, use the straight edge, line it up here, then check my spacing gauge, and go ahead and stitch the spine, and it would connect to all of the feathers. But I'm just going to leave this spineless for now. This is a 3-inch feather doing the first method shown in the instructions. And to recap that method, the pattern here is simply to stitch from A all the way around to B, backtrack to C. Reposition the template. From C, stitch to A, then all the way around to B, and back to C. And repeat, and you have feathers. This is the second method. It's shown here in the instructions. So basically we're going to use the same markings on the template, A, B, and C. They aren't shown on the instructions, but since you know those markings from the last method, I thought that'd be the easiest way to show you. So what we're going to do is stitch this feather one side at a time, and we're going to use a spine because we are going to backtrack around the outside of the feather here and alternate that with backtracking up the spine. So stitch, the red is backtrack, stitch, go up the spine, stitch the plume, backtrack, stitch, up the spine, stitch, and backtrack. That's why it shows that we're backtracking on every other plume in the feather. So we'll be going from the outside to the inside of the feather. Now, since this one has a spine, we can actually stitch that first so that we know we'll be backtracking on stitches that we've already done. So method 2 will go right here. Same dimensions as the first example. But this time, I'm going to use my spine template, and I'm going to begin at the top. So this is where I would be putting my finial or some decorative something on the end of my feathers. I'm just going to drop my needle here, start off with a couple of small stitches, and lay my feather template right along here. Check the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and go ahead and stitch this to where my project begins. So these are the edges of where I want my feathers to be. My spine is stitched up the center. Find my template, and I think I'll stitch this side first, just because that's the way they do it in the directions. I'm going to line A up with the edge of my project line, and go ahead and stitch all the way around, and I can stop right there at the spine. Now I'll just backtrack back up my feather to C. Sometimes it helps if you don't move the template. Makes backtracking a lot easier. So move the template, line up the center, and go ahead and stitch a plume all the way to the spine. And now that the spine is stitched, I've got a very definite mark on where to stop. So I find stitching feathers to a spine much easier than stitching to a reference line on my fabric. All I need to do here, since I backtracked back to C, on the next plume, I'm just going to backtrack on the spine up to my next position. My next position will be where I can make contact with my previous plume right about here. So I'm just going to, well, I'm not going to use a template. I'm just going to backtrack right on those stitches up to the point that right there, my ruler foot touched the template. So then I'll just go around to B, backtrack to C. Move the template, match up the center line, then go ahead and stitch my template. Stop on the spine, and go ahead and leaving the center and 1/4 inch here, just backtrack up the spine. Backtrack to C. Okay, I'll do one more. So, template comes up, put it into position, center line up. What can I do now? I have some options here. I can stitch back to the spine. I could add one more feather or one more plume because my spine comes up to here, but we'll deal with that later. I ended here with this half of my feather. I can tie off here. I can backtrack to the spine, stitch the spine all the way back, and start here and stitch the other side. I could come to the spine, make the finial, and stitch my feathers coming down this side. I'm not really great at stitching back down the spine this way, so I usually opt to go back to the spine and travel back down. I think I'll just tie it off and do this the way I usually do. So I put some very close stitches right there. I'm just going to pull up the bobbin thread and cut top and bobbin thread off at the same time. Put my template where I can see I stitched the first feather, and then just slide my template over like so, and I'll be in about the same position. My center is straight here, so drop my needle here, and I'll begin and do the same stitching that I just did. Do you find it easier to stitch with the plume going up like this, or is it easier for you to look here and then stitch with your template coming from this direction. A lot of times you have favorites, and that's great. However, it is good to try and do it both ways, so you're familiar with that. Just in case you want to stitch a larger project and you don't have as many options, I'll show you this method. Pull up my bobbin thread. Okay. And again, center line. I can now see the etched line much better as it's right there on top of my stitched spine, so much easier. If you recall, when I started, I backtracked to begin here. This time I'm coming back to the spine, and I'm going to move up the spine, put my template in place where I want my next plume to stitch, and then backtrack up the spine because I didn't backtrack up this part of the spine last time. Then go back to C. I think it's probably easiest to see this direction. And slide the template, find your center line, and stitch the spine. You can actually line your feathers up so that you have all of your feather plumes lining up with its opposite number. So put your template in place, and that's really basically determined by a 1/4 inch here. Center line, and then backtrack, and you can see that where this is going to take off from the spine is right here, which is directly opposite the other feather plume. Backtrack to C. So if I want to do a finial, I can do a larger finial here because I'm just starting for just a touch lower on the feather. So I'm just going to backtrack up the plume on one side. And which way do I want I can make The first example I stitched out is on the right. It has no spine. And the second example is on the left.